And then I do virtual visits as well. And thyroid is one of my areas of specialty, and just there's so much that's kind of not widely known or understood about the root causes of thyroid issues. So I'm excited to get into that. We love educating people on their health at Tummy Temple and just kind of being teachers and helping people be better able to advocate for themselves and work toward their own healing. So we teach these classes, or I've been teaching these classes through Marlene's quarterly, and then we have other classes that we teach just through Tummy Temple. We have a whole classes section over there. Some of those classes I participate in teaching, and then there are some other great ones taught by some of our other awesome practitioners, including Heidi, who's a brilliant nutritionist. So there's just a lot of resources that that we like to share if you are interested in checking any of that out in the future. So I want to jump into the class. So just a little bit of background. Hypothyroidism, or low thyroid function, is such a common condition. It affects probably 20 million Americans, and up to 60% of those people are actually not aware they have a thyroid issue. It disproportionately affects women. Up to 8 times more women than men will develop a thyroid disorder, and actually 1 in 8 women will develop a thyroid disorder during her lifetime. So such a pertinent area to understand. The thyroid gland sits right here at the base of the neck, and it's a small butterfly-shaped gland that produces 2 endocrine hormones. And endocrine just means that the hormones get released into the bloodstream and travel all over the body and have their effects at distant sites to where they're manufactured. So the 2 hormones are T4 and T3 for short. The long names are thyroxine and triiodothyronine. And so those are released into the bloodstream, and they travel all over the body, and they're actually taken up by every single cell type and every single cell in the body, where they increase metabolic rate and basically just have an effect on nearly everything. So they play a direct role in our health and normal functioning of the brain, the gut, the heart, the bones, the blood, the liver, gallbladder, hormone production, blood sugar balance, cholesterol, metabolism, body temperature. Just it runs the gambit. So it's helpful to kind of think of the thyroid as the thermostat of the body. So in a hyperthyroid condition, there would be too much thyroid hormone present, and that would be like turning up the thermostat. So you might experience feeling overheated, sweating excessively, and then just being kind of jittery, anxious, not being able to sleep, losing weight excessively, and then things just pass through you really fast. So loose stools, diarrhea, the heart is just kind of galloping, racing. There can be palpitations. And then long-term, bones, the bones are turning over too fast. And so there's often osteoporosis or weakening of the bones. So then conversely, the more common situation is hypothyroidism, or too little thyroid hormone. And so that's like turning the thermostat way down. So you would feel tired, often cold, constipated, the digestion slows way down. Still trouble sleeping though, a lot of times. Easy to gain weight, put on weight, and the hair doesn't grow as robustly. So oftentimes there's more hair falling out than growing in. So there can be kind of diffuse hair thinning. and then dry skin, brain fog, and just achy muscles and joints as the sort of healing on a cellular level isn't happening as well.
You know, Dr. Jennea, I always think it's interesting that with the hypothyroid, people almost always assume that if you have hypothyroid, you're overweight. And I just have found so many people who are regular weight and are hypothyroid, or so like I have a little bit of hypothyroid, and people are like, but you're not overweight. I'm like, yeah, but I have all those other symptoms. So I think a lot of times people just really focus in on that one. And it's really good to realize that like all these other things you're talking about, you don't have to be overweight. It could be the dry skin and the cold and the hair and the.
Yeah, that's such a great point. You do not have to have all of the symptoms to point to low thyroid function. You know, sometimes people have just one or two. You know, sometimes people generally feel okay, and it's really early on in the course of a thyroid issue, so it'll come up on testing, and thus far, you know, it's sort of like an early warning sign, but they're kind of doing okay. I think I just saw someone raise their hand. Did someone want to ask a question?
If you want to ask a question, I would suggest putting it in the box, or if you did raise your hand, you could unmute yourself and ask.
It was just a mistake. Sorry.
No problem.
No worries. Okay. Okay. So the most common types of thyroid disorders are really the most common is Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And at its root, this is actually a disease of the immune system, not exactly of the thyroid, but it's very localized and targeted to the thyroid. So that's the most common situation in the United States. It used to be that in other countries, it was very common to have iodine deficiency, but that's actually changed in the last 10 years or so. And now there are hardly any countries where people are deficient in iodine to the degree that it causes thyroid disease. So that has kind of changed. And that's a lot about kind of the food system and iodizing salt and things like that. So Hashimoto's is probably becoming more common worldwide, but definitely the most common thyroid disease in the US. It is an autoimmune disease where the immune system is producing antibodies that tag the cells of the thyroid for destruction. And so with any autoimmune disease, there's a lot going on behind the scenes that's resulting in that that effect. That's not a normal behavior for the immune system, and so there are a variety of things that can contribute to that. So a lot of the things we'll be talking about today as root causes of thyroid disease would actually apply to really any autoimmune disease. And a lot of times people, if they have one autoimmune disease, they're more likely to develop another for just that reason. So that's a useful thing to bear in mind. So some of the things we'll be talking about today are nutrient deficiencies and excesses, hormone imbalances other than the thyroid, low stomach acid, imbalances in the gut microbiome, and others. And all of these things tend to kind of play into a vicious cycle that ends up causing Hashimoto's. So with Hashimoto's in particular, early in the disease, people can actually swing back and forth between symptoms of too little and too much thyroid hormone. And that's because if some of the cells are dying off, as they die off, they contain thyroid hormone, and so they release their load of thyroid hormone when they die. And so that can cause like little bursts of excess thyroid hormone. So people might notice swinging back and forth between like feeling anxious and jittery and having racing heart or palpitations, and then sluggishness and exhaustion and feeling really chilly, kind of bouncing around a little bit. But ultimately, people usually end up, eventually with Hashimoto's, people go to the just low thyroid hormone state.
It's a little quick question,
Mhm.
which is, can your hypothyroidism turn to Hashimoto's disease? How do you know when it moves to Hashimoto's? So I think there's a little confusion in that one.
Yeah, so the main way that you tell the difference is through testing antibodies. So I will actually get into explaining the the specific. So Graves' disease is the specific only hyperthyroid state, and then Hashimoto's ends up low thyroid or hypothyroid, but can bounce back and forth initially. And so yeah, I'll kind of explain a
So
little bit more
you
in
could
just
also have hypothyroidism and not have Hashimoto's. So I think that's
yes.
the
Yeah, that
key.
is also true. So there are some reasons, essentially, like to diagnose Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is an autoimmune disease, or Graves', which is autoimmune hyperthyroid. You're looking for antibodies, and so those are very specific lab tests that get run to show that. Some people don't have any thyroid antibodies and they still have low thyroid function. And there's a lot of overlap in the root causes, actually. So some of the same, and I'll kind of go through that as we go through the different root causes. Some of them are more likely to be a problem with Hashimoto's or more likely to trigger Hashimoto's. Some of them can do either or can contribute to kind of non-autoimmune low thyroid function or hypothyroidism or Hashimoto's hypothyroid or low thyroid function. So I'll try to specify as we go.
Thank you.
So conventionally, Hashimoto's is treated by, once your thyroid levels get low enough, we replace the lost thyroid hormone by taking it in the form of a pill. And, in natural medicine, we often do that as well. In many or most cases, if your thyroid hormone is low enough, your body just doesn't work very well. It's going to be very hard to heal without enough thyroid hormone because it plays such an important role in so many functions in the body. So, but the main difference is that in conventional medicine, that's it. There's no other treatments, no looking at other potential root causes. It's just replace the lost hormone. And then in natural medicine, we try to understand why that's happening and dig a little deeper on root causes. So I would replace the lost hormone and, work to identify the reasons why the immune system started acting, basically going rogue, and work to remove or shift those root causes, improve digestion and absorption of nutrients, correct nutrient deficiencies, support the stress response and hormone balance, and more. So and that's going to be different from person to person, which areas they need particular support with. So just to be thorough, Graves' disease is much less common, but it's important to mention. So it's also a disease of the immune system, not technically of the thyroid gland, but it manifests as thyroid disease. And this one is an autoimmune disease where the immune system produces this very particular type of antibody that instead of tagging the thyroid for destruction, it actually stimulates the thyroid gland to produce more and more and more hormone. So this is actually harder to treat and more harmful because the effects of too much thyroid hormone are more dangerous and can cause dangerous heart arrhythmias and really have a negative impact. Probably the most dangerous would be the effects on the cardiovascular system. So in conventional medicine, it's treated by using medications to suppress the thyroid function. And then if that doesn't work well enough, actually purposefully killing off the thyroid gland and then replacing, the person would take thyroid hormone to replace that lost function for the rest of their life. And then, as we kind of clarified a few minutes ago, there is hypothyroidism that's not autoimmune in nature. And, it's possible to just have an underdeveloped thyroid gland or a smaller thyroid gland. Nutrient deficiencies really play into that. And we'll talk about some of the other things. So just, I'm going to run through the tests that I like to start with. And if anyone saw the article that was put out in the Marlene's newsletter, it went through a lot of this as well, and was outlined there. So a lot of times people come to see me and the only tests they've ever had done are free T4 and TSH, or sometimes just TSH. And that just does not give a very thorough look at the thyroid. Sometimes the TSH will be normal, but the amounts of thyroid hormone are low. And so it misses a lot of issues there. Sometimes the antibodies, which in the case of Hashimoto's are called Anti-Tpo antibodies and anti-TG or Thyroglobulin antibodies. A lot of times, people come in who have never had that checked. And so sometimes those antibodies can be high, but it's early in the course of the disease and their TSH actually looks fine so far. So I like to just do a thorough panel to start with when someone has symptoms of thyroid issues, or if they know they have a thyroid problem, but we want to get a more complete look at it. So I always start with free T3, free T4, TSH, or also known as thyroid stimulating hormone, reverse T3, which is an inactive form of thyroid hormone. So it's primarily when we're under a lot of stress, so our cortisol, our stress hormone levels are really high, and or when we have high levels of inflammation in the body will take the free T4 hormone and convert it to this inactive storage form of T3 called reverse T3. And so that can be a really, really useful indicator of when there's an issue that's manifesting as low thyroid function that actually is an issue with the adrenal glands and the stress response system, or with elevated inflammation from other causes. And then the final two tests are the anti-TPO antibodies and the anti-TG antibodies. The only time I would run the Graves' disease pertinent antibody just if someone had symptoms of excess thyroid hormone, and if on the previous testing they had too much of the free T4, too much of the free T3, or really low or suppressed TSH. So that one, the Graves' disease pertinent antibody, is called thyroid stimulating immunoglobulin, or TSI.
Dr. Wood, this is a really interesting point, and then also an interesting question. I don't know if people have experienced this before, but so you can go in and get some thyroid testing, and some people will look and say, oh, this is a normal range for thyroid right here. And other people will say, actually, really the normal range is here. And so if you're out here, I think you might actually be already having a little bit of thyroid difficulty, but it wasn't caught because maybe the practitioner that you saw had a much wider range idea of what is normal. And we're more looking at optimal.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to say that because I've had people before be like, oh no, it was fine. And then I'm like, well, what's the range that they were looking at? And that can make a really big difference in how you proceed and catching things early and things like that.
Absolutely.
And this question that came up is, how do you evaluate kids for thyroid issues, especially if there are several generations with thyroid disease in the family?
I mean, I look at them really pretty similarly. I would still run those antibodies, especially if there's a family history of thyroid disease. The tendency to develop Hashimoto's um, definitely runs in families. Like any autoimmune disease, there's a genetic predisposition that makes you more likely to develop that. So that's, it's so much more likely that if you have parents or grandparents with a thyroid condition, first of all, it's more likely that the child would eventually develop it, although not a given. It's not certain that if your parents had it, you'll develop it, but it's more likely. And then also more likely that it's the Hashimoto's type because of that autoimmune nature and that genetic predisposition. So yeah, I mean, I would do the testing exactly the same. And, I don't see a whole lot of kids, so I would double check on lab reference ranges, but I think they're pretty similar. And what Heidi said is absolutely an important point. The lab range, especially for TSH, is huge. And, it's sort of like they sampled thousands and thousands of people's TSH and just like picked a median. And it, didn't pay a whole lot of attention to whether those people felt amazing or poorly, or, it's just, this is like what most people fell into. And so, yeah, it's actually called subclinical hypothyroidism when your TSH or your thyroid hormone levels aren't optimal, but they're technically within the normal range. So, and that, there actually is a lot of research showing that people do so much better when their subclinical hypothyroidism is treated as hypothyroidism. And, they actually are treated based off of that. So with any autoimmune disease, there is essentially a three-legged stool that allows, that kind of sets up the situation for an autoimmune condition. So that certainly applies here. So one of them is having the right genes. One of them is intestinal permeability or leaky gut. And then one of them is some sort of environmental trigger, which can be a number of these next kind of root cause topics that we're going to talk about. So, you can't change your genes, but you can modify these other root causes, and therefore it is absolutely possible to put Hashimoto's or other autoimmune diseases into remission. It's not always super easy. There can be a lot of digging and a lot of, figuring out and changing underlying patterns, changing diet. There can be a lot that goes into it, but it's absolutely possible. So, for starters, with root causes, this is such a broad one, but inflammation from some source promotes the conversion of T4 to that inactive or reverse T3. And then also sort of flares up immune activity in a way that can cause collateral damage to the thyroid. Kind of, that's such a broad one, and a lot of these other next topics to be discussed are some of the things that lead to increased inflammation. But there can be increased inflammation just from like eating processed foods or all so many things that we're not going to get into all of the potential reasons for inflammation today, but we are going to get
a whole nother class for that.
I know, totally. It's like so many. So a little more detail on leaky gut, and many of you may be aware of this or sort of understand this process, but it bears repeating. So the lining of the intestines is supposed to act as this very selective barrier between the food that you eat and the rest of your body, your bloodstream, your bones, your muscles, essentially between what's not you, so food, bacteria, etc., and what is you, what's makes up the cells of your body. So food is digested as it passes through the tube of the digestive system. It's meant to be digested down into its most basic component parts. So proteins get broken down into individual amino acids, carbohydrates get broken down into glucose molecules, and then fats get emulsified into teeny tiny droplets. And then once they're broken down to this level, they're not recognizable anymore as the food that you ate. They're just building blocks. And at that point, that's when they're supposed to be absorbed through the walls of the intestines through these very specific mechanisms into the bloodstream, so they can be taken up by different parts of your body to build and repair and nourish your body. So importantly, the immune system really doesn't like finding non-self items in the bloodstream. And so when that selective barrier starts to break down and get irritated and inflamed, and, like the walls get sort of roughed up and have bigger gaps in them, the walls of the intestines, you start to have a little bit of leaking of larger pieces of protein and of little bits of bacteria and, little kind of pieces of food that, not like a big hunk of food could get through there, but food breakdown components in a form that the immune system can still recognize them as something that's not you. So that triggers a big immune reaction. Essentially, the body looks at that as like an invader or an infection getting into your bloodstream and mounts a big reaction to it as if it's fighting an infection. And then that kind of fight against the infection affects the entire body. That is a big part of what causes inflammation in the body. So that's one of the major ways that any sort of inflammation is caused in the body is by irritating or inflaming the lining of the intestines. And that is actually a topic that we've done probably multiple classes on, but we have a whole class on healing leaky gut. Because it is a big topic and not something we'll be able to get into in detail here.
I'll put a link to the recording in the chat box.
Thank you, Heidi. But it's such an important thing. It's one of the three legs of that stool of autoimmunity. And so, if you're able to disrupt that process and get the lining of the intestines intact again, that can take a huge chunk out of the risk of developing Hashimoto's or Graves or any autoimmune disease. And so that kind of brings us to the next couple topics, which are big factors in causing and contributing to leaky gut. One of which is stress and adrenal dysfunction. So, we know that stress absolutely impacts that lining of the intestinal, of the intestines. And with leaky gut, we're really talking about the small intestine. So stress does that. It has that impact. And then it also, separately from its effect on the digestive tract, promotes that conversion of T4 to the reverse T3, or that inactive storage form. The adrenal glands are basically our stress response system. So the way that we cope with stress is essentially managed through the adrenal glands. So they are little triangular glands that sit like little caps on top of the kidneys. And they make up a crucial part of our hormone system in the body, and they work very closely with the thyroid gland. So they're another aspect of how we are able to have energy to wake up in the morning and get through the day and to respond to stress appropriately. They produce a bunch of different hormones, but as far as the stress response is concerned, it's essentially adrenaline and cortisol. So adrenaline is the super fast acting one that helps you like respond when someone darts in front of you in traffic, helps you like hop to and hit the brake in time, and makes your heart race, and but also kind of makes your vision better and helps you respond in quick, dangerous situations. And then cortisol is a slower burning hormone that helps us cope with stress by mobilizing more sugar in the blood so that we could like keep running for longer in a longer term stressful situation, or make it through the night if we had to pull an all-nighter for some reason. So that one of the super important aspects of cortisol is that it's our steroid hormone that keeps inflammation in the body low. So if you are at all aware of conventional treatment of autoimmune diseases, they're often treated by not so much with Hashimoto's, but with other more dangerous ones. They're treated by giving people really high doses of steroid hormones that are essentially cortisol, but times 500 or times 1,000, like way stronger, but the same thing. So cortisol is what our bodies do to balance inflammation and prevent it from getting out of control. So what happens when we're under chronic stress for years is that our cortisol balance gets all out of whack. It can be high when it's supposed to be low. Essentially, it's supposed to peak in the morning to help us wake up in the morning, and it actually kills off autoimmune cells in that peak, and then slowly go down throughout the day so that we can go to sleep at night. So it can start behaving really strangely and peak at night and be low in the morning, or can just be low all the time. And that can really contribute to inflammation levels getting out of control from a different perspective, because we can't tamp it down as we would normally be able to. If the adrenals are not working well, the thyroid has to work way harder and is seriously affected. So I always check in about symptoms of adrenal issues, and talk to my patients about their stress levels and what they do when confronted with a really stressful event, what their coping mechanisms are, because getting that situation in order and having good coping mechanisms are crucial. So we put together a little sort of online resource of some of the products we use for gut healing support, adrenal support, etc. And so the products that I like to use for that are, they have sort of funny names, but ADB5 Plus is one of my favorites. And then ashwagandha is it's a single herb. It's really helpful for balancing both the thyroid and the adrenal system. Nerve tonic is really simple, a single herb that's just so calming to the nervous system. So those are some of the things that we tend to use. Any questions so far? Okay. All right, so getting back to the leaky gut topic, another aspect that's so important.
There's actually a quick question that came through, which is how long in your experience does it take for the gut to heal? And at what point do we want to consider that something else besides the gut lining that might be contributing?
The gut lining is one of the most rapidly healing tissue types in the body. So it will start healing and have, be able to heal quite significantly within 3 to 5 days, given the opportunity. So the caveat is that oftentimes there are so many things bothering the intestinal lining and causing there to be persistent irritation and damage that, the 3 to 5 days is if you've identified and removed those irritating factors, if you've kind of gotten your stress under control and, chew your food thoroughly and, practice eating in a relaxed state and avoid, figure out if there are any particular foods that bother you and irritate your intestines in particular and are staying away from those. And then kind of the next topic that I was going to get into is hidden infections. And so sometimes there's just a persistent intestinal infection that's really contributing to ongoing intestinal permeability or leaky gut that really needs to be addressed specifically for the gut lining to be able to heal. And so, if you're trying a sort of gut healing protocol, I would give it, I would expect to see some benefits within 2 to 4 weeks, not necessarily done, but significant benefits. And if you're not seeing any benefits, that's time to look further and potentially seek out probably either stool testing or breath testing for small intestine bacterial overgrowth tend to be the ways that you figure out if there is an intestinal infection that's causing there to be persistent leaky gut. So hidden infections are one of the huge triggers that contribute to thyroid disease. They don't have to be intestinal infections, but they commonly are. So that is a situation where the immune system is flared up and behaving sort of strangely because it's trying, but usually not quite successful, to fight off some sort of hidden infection. So there are some viruses that actually hang out in the thyroid. And so that's what the immune system is attacking and causing some collateral damage to the thyroid gland. And then infections in the intestines are, they're not local to the thyroid gland, but they're causing leaky gut and they're causing there to be immune system dysregulation. And so if those get addressed by getting rid of the intestinal infection, it can make a huge difference. Epstein-Barr virus is the most commonly known virus to bother the thyroid gland. And there is blood testing to look for persistent viral infections as well. So those are kind of the first places I look as far as hidden infections, are testing for chronic viruses and ruling out gut infections. The next root cause is environmental toxicity. So there are a number of different environmental pollutants that can wreak havoc on the thyroid gland. Probably the ones that are common offenders are halogens, so bromine and chlorine are two of the most common, and fluoride that we get exposed to in our environment. So fluoride gets added to the water, bromide gets added to breads and baked goods. And then chlorine also gets added to the water and is present in bleach and cleaning products. So those can sort of actually displace iodine out of the thyroid, where it is completely necessary to form thyroid hormone. And so exposure to a lot of those compounds can really disrupt thyroid health. And then heavy metals are well known to disrupt the thyroid as well. And mold can be very toxic to the thyroid. That can certainly play a role, as can formaldehyde, as can some of the compounds found in breast implants. And actually, breast implants can grow mold in the body, which is a terrible situation. And so identifying and removing exposures to environmental toxicants is a really, really important aspect of healing from thyroid disease. And then, the first and most important thing is to remove the exposure, but doing some cleansing work, doing some, infrared saunas and liver support and cleansing work can make a huge impact, both because removing those toxicants from the body helps the thyroid work better, and also because the liver actually does at least 30% of the conversion of T4 to the more active T3 thyroid hormone. And so if the liver isn't working very well, that conversion slows way down. And so I have actually seen people go through our guided cleanse that we take people through at Tummy Temple and be having hyper or excess thyroid symptoms afterward because suddenly their thyroid's working better and they need a lower dose of their thyroid hormone supplement. And I've also seen that with treating hidden infections, and also with getting the adrenal glands to work better. So, I've absolutely seen the thyroid kind of kick it up a notch and essentially regain some of its quote unquote lost function through using some of these techniques. I don't go into it expecting that people will not need their thyroid hormone anymore. Sometimes there has been too much of the function lost and they'll still need some thyroid hormone supplementation long term. But I have definitely seen it, the need or the dose of thyroid hormone need to be reduced with working with and identifying and removing some of these exposures.
I'm going to put a link in the chat box to our webpage that talks more about the 10-day Revive Cleanse that Dr. Wood is talking about.
Thank you, Heidi. Yeah, I really find that people do so well on that cleanse. There are a lot of cleanses out there, and there are a lot of good cleanses out there, and I really see people do fantastically well with the Revive Cleanse. Makes a big difference in a lot of health concerns. All right, next topic, which this is actually kind of a newer thing that I've become aware of within the past like 8 months or so. I did a continuing education class that talked about the effects of excess iodine. And that was not something I had been aware of previously. I had learned that, if anything, people were at least a little bit iodine deficient and could benefit from supplementing some iodine. But it turns out that over the past 10 years or so, there's just been accumulating research that most of us, especially in the US, but more and more in most every country, are actually getting too much iodine from our diets and lifestyles. And iodine it's absolutely needed for the thyroid, but it's quite a narrow window of how much we need, and then it's very easy to tip over that into too much. So the sort of safe dose is about 50 to 150 micrograms per day. So not milligrams, micrograms, which is 1,000 times less than a milligram. So it's actually a very small amount. And if we didn't have that, it would be really bad. We absolutely need it. It's crucial for thyroid health. And it's very easy to get more than that. Especially with some of the ways that we process food in this country. You know, we've iodized the salt because there was a problem with too little iodine, but we just overshot. So iodized salt is used a lot, but interestingly, Himalayan pink salt has twice as much iodine as iodized salt. So it's actually it's even more easy in the sort of natural medicine, you know, like health nut leaning world to go even further overboard. And then the other biggest sources are seaweed, seafood, dairy, because the cow's udders get treated with iodine to prevent infections, eggs, and then commercially baked goods, iodine gets added as a dough conditioner. And then it's often found in multivitamins, you know, people will just take iodine supplements, and can actually be found in a lot of cosmetics. And it absorbs very easily through the skin. So I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think, you know, a small serving of seaweed has like thousands of micrograms. An egg probably has something like 40 micrograms or something like that. So I'm not going to get into the details of how much is in each thing, because that's more of a spreadsheet type of situation. But but it's actually very easy to get too much. And then other important things to note about that are that sensitivity to iodine varies a lot based on genetics. So some of us have ancestors that lived in coastal areas and actually are sort of adapted to getting excess iodine and just cope with it a little bit better. Other of us have ancestors that are from areas with very little iodine, you know, in the soil or available anywhere. And so our ancestors actually may have developed a capacity to absorb every little bit of iodine. And so it's way easier for certain people to overshoot. And it's actually possible, if this is a big factor for someone, to normalize their thyroid function solely by reducing iodine intake down to a level where your body can sort of work through the backlog, because our bodies don't get rid of iodine in any other way other than turning it into thyroid hormone. So if you want to learn more about that topic, the doctor who's kind of dedicated the past decade of his life to researching this is Dr. Alan Christensen. And he wrote a book called The Thyroid Reset Diet. That's basically like a step-by-step approach to going through stages of an first very low iodine diet and then sort of like a maintenance phase. And then on the other side, nutrient deficiencies can also play a big role in thyroid dysfunction. So selenium is sort of the partner nutrient to iodine. It's a powerful antioxidant. And so when there's excess iodine in the thyroid, it causes a lot of oxidation. And so that oxidation can be the reason that the immune system gets flared up and starts, like, you know, causing a little autoimmune situation there. And so selenium really helps protect against that oxidation. So the worst case scenario is excess iodine and deficient selenium. If you still have the iodine, but you add in a bunch of selenium, that helps buffer it and balance it more. And then the best case scenario would be getting the iodine down to optimal level, and then having plenty of selenium present. And probably the ideal dose for most people for selenium is 200 micrograms per day. And the best form is called selenomethionine. That's the most absorbable form. And it is found in reasonably large amounts, can be very large amounts in Brazil nuts, but it really depends on the selenium content of the soil where the Brazil nuts were grown. And so it does kind of vary somewhat. So, it's not a bad idea to take a selenium supplement. And it is actually possible to go overboard on selenium, probably above like 600 micrograms a day would be getting into probably too much. So the 200 is about right. Other nutrients that are super important for thyroid health are iron, which I don't want, I wouldn't want just anybody to be taking iron. You would really want to work with your doctor, get your ferritin or iron storage levels checked, and supplement if needed. But if someone is low in iron, that's very important for thyroid conversion to the active form, and just for energy production in the body in general. Zinc is very, very important. And one of the issues that can lead to nutrient deficiencies is that a lot of times people with low thyroid function develop low stomach acid. And then with low stomach acid, you really can't absorb zinc. And so, and actually without zinc, you can't make stomach acid. So it's sort of a very unfortunate situation. And so getting zinc levels up through supplementation can be really, really crucial, both because the zinc's important for the thyroid gland itself, as well as for making stomach acid and for kind of countless other things in the body. Copper is also important. Vitamin A, vitamin E, all the B vitamins. Tyrosine is a particular amino acid that forms the backbone of the thyroid hormone. And then omega-3 fats, especially fish oil, is very balancing for inflammation and can be really helpful with thyroid issues. The reason why there's so many nutrient deficiencies, I mean, one of them is the low stomach acid issue, but we also just have been using farming practices in this country for so long that deplete minerals in the soil and make it harder for the plants to pull enough minerals out of the soil. A lot of our foods are highly processed, which removes minerals. And then, just eating a diet higher in processed foods with a lot of food additives, that all contributes. And then dysbiosis or imbalances of the bacteria in our guts really affects nutrient absorption as well.
So Dr. Jennea, there's a question of, do you check for all of these nutrients when you're testing, or do you do that further down the line?
I certainly have in the past. It's usually not where I start because there are usually only so many tests that one person can do at one time. And it always seems, a bit more foundational and going to move the needle faster to identify a gut infection, for instance, first. But there is micronutrient testing that I run sometimes, and that can be really helpful when we're just not sure, when supplementing is maybe not working quite right, and we're a little bit stuck and want a more targeted plan, essentially. So yeah, there's a blood test looking at the cellular levels of a lot of these nutrients, which can be really helpful. And then people with Hashimoto's are actually 5 times more likely to be diagnosed with celiac disease, which is, a major condition of malabsorption. And so that will especially lead to so many nutrient deficiencies. So especially if someone has a lot of digestive symptoms, it's definitely worth checking for celiac disease. And bear in mind that you have to check for that before you start avoiding gluten. If you've just put yourself on a gluten-free diet and been on that for a while, and you feel better that way, but you get some here and there. Unfortunately, in order to accurately test for celiac disease, you have to be eating at least 1 slice of bread or the equivalent per day for a month to get an accurate test, which can be really torturous to have to go back on it to figure out if it's celiac disease or gluten sensitivity. And there's a pretty big difference as far as long-term consequences. So if at all possible, try to catch people and, run the blood testing for celiac disease first before recommending a gluten-free diet. And, some of the things that I think taking a trace mineral supplement without iodine can be really helpful for building back up nutrient stores. Other good options are things like nettle tea, alfalfa tea, that are very mineral rich. And then we use a concentrate trace mineral drops as well as another option. So, and then finally, gluten intolerance, separate from celiac disease, is quite common in Hashimoto's. It's probably the most common food intolerance to be found in people with Hashimoto's. So, it's often worth just checking for celiac disease first, but a lot of times people do much, much better avoiding gluten. And we will sometimes have people just to avoid little trace exposures to gluten when someone is really sensitive to it. We use a digestive enzyme called Similase GFCF that specifically has enzymes to break down gluten and casein, which is a protein in dairy. And our Temple Total Digest formula has that as well. So that can be just a really helpful tool if you're eating out and you don't know exactly what's in it, or maybe it was near someone else's bread and you happen to have a great sensitivity to gluten. That's a useful tool. So basic self-care, we're coming to the end of the class, so I'm just gonna go over basic self-care for the thyroid and then wrap up. And if there are any other questions, I would be so happy to answer them. So eating a nutrient-dense diet is so important. A lot of people, one thing that I didn't really get into is Goitrogens, which are compounds found in plants that can have a suppressive effect on the thyroid, and are found in kale and broccoli and cabbage and all of the foods in that family. I'm not too worried about those in general, unless you're eating a ton of raw kale or a ton of raw vegetables in that plant family. Juicing kale would probably be the absolute worst thing for someone with a thyroid issue. But as long as it's cooked and you're just eating, normal amounts, normal serving size, not the amount that you would be able to concentrate into a juice, most people with thyroid issues actually do fine with some of those foods, and they have so many other anti-cancer effects and wonderful health benefits that I don't like to tell people not to eat them. Rule out celiac disease, and then potentially avoid gluten if you're sensitive to it. And generally works well to start out with a 6-week elimination diet, see how you feel off of it, and then if it's not totally obvious how you're doing off of it, try reintroducing it for a couple days and see if you notice any old symptoms come back. And then make sure you're getting plenty of minerals, plenty of nutrients, potentially take a good quality multivitamin without iodine. Those mineral rich teas like red raspberry leaf is another, tea is another one, nettle leaf tea, alfalfa tea, trace mineral supplement. It's so important to get enough of those trace minerals. And then work on gut health. And, heartburn can be a sign of low stomach acid. Difficulty digesting meat can be a big sign of low stomach acid. So, get support and start supporting your digestion so that you can actually absorb your minerals. And that is the end of the class today.
We do have a couple of questions. Thank you, Dr. Wood, and thank you for everyone for coming. And thank you, Elizabeth and Marlene's for hosting. We understand if people have to drop off, but there are some questions too, so we can answer those. It looks like the question is, one, does dairy impact thyroid? And then the other question is, any suggestions for a diet for thyroid nodules?
Dairy can absolutely be a problem for thyroid conditions. It really is individual, but that other than gluten, that's probably the other most common food intolerance. So, I oftentimes will have people do food intolerance testing. It's a blood test for IgG food reactions. And that can be really helpful because, I've encountered people where gluten and dairy are actually fine and bananas and dates are their big problem. So, dairy, gluten, eggs are probably the most common food intolerances out there, but it's definitely not always those foods.
Soy and corn. Whew.
Yeah, and corn. As far as nodules, I can't really, there are some herbs that I will use for that. That would be more of a sort of customized plan and a consult situation. I don't have a diet, solely a diet to address nodules or something that would be easily conveyed at this moment. But yeah, there are definitely things that can help with that.
And we will be sending an email out after this. And if people end up making an appointment in the next week, then we get a little bit of a discount. And so we'll send all that information in the email to everyone. So look for that. There is also a question, if there's a pituitary deficiency, how would thyroid treatment differ? And so this is also getting into a little bit of the complex range where it might be really helpful to have a consult, but I don't know if you have a quick answer.
Yeah, I mean, there's different testing for that. So that would be the place to start to figure out. And then if you're saying that you've already been told that that's the issue, then yeah, that's sort of outside the purview of this class, but it's certainly something that there are potentially ways to work with that, ways to support the pituitary. And I would just, I would need a deeper understanding of the situation to really speak to that.
Okay, great. All right, I think that we are good. And
thank you all for coming and bringing your questions.
Thank you everyone so much. We're gonna say goodbye to everyone on Facebook Live. Goodbye.
Have a good night.